And welcome back to Politico Coffee Break. I'm Ryan Heath, political editor here at Politico Europe, and joining me is David Herszenh, our chief Brussels correspondent. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Ryan.
Now, let's cast back our eyes and our minds to one of the events of the week, not the hot mess that is Brexit, but Angela Merkel giving what probably is her swan song speech to the European Parliament. And she laid out a bit of a lament or a plea for Europe in general and its value. No surprise there when you're coming to the Parliament and you're a pro-European. But one of the things that really stood out was her call for working towards a vision for a European army. Not the actual army itself. But David, what were your gut reactions, your first reactions when you heard her talking about that?
Well, this is part of a much bigger week for Europe. Remember, this actually all started over the weekend in Paris with the commemoration of the 100th anniversary, the centennial of Armistice Day that ended World War I. And Angela Merkel is one of those European leaders who understands quite well that the European Union, the European project, is forged in bloodshed, that this is no joke. This is a continent that used to kill each other, that was at war, and now has an alliance, a union that works towards peace and prosperity. And so during that weekend of commemorations in Paris, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, had also called for an EU army. That was partly a pushback on the United States. Donald Trump was there as well, and called it very insulting what Macron was saying. But Merkel was following up, and it was actually quite a show of solidarity. Another example of the solidarity we've seen this week, where she's saying in the Parliament, Macron is right. She's actually said it before. Europe needs to work toward an EU army. What that means is Europe needs to protect itself. Europe shouldn't be relying on big brother across the ocean, that Europe should be able to do operations in Africa, to do peacekeeping missions, to face down Russia and provide a security guarantee for the Baltics. So her message was an aspirational one. We know there are a lot of obstacles, operational as well as logistical, financial, political, most of all, because not everybody for sure is behind this concept. But it was a very strong message from Merkel. She has nothing to lose anymore. She said she's not going to be running again. So for her to get up there in front of the Parliament as part of a series of speeches by leaders on the future of Europe and say that the EU army is a priority. Again, Germany is not a country that has made military defense the biggest priority in its participation in the EU for many historical reasons. So for her to say that was quite significant.
It was also a bit of a cost-free promise. I noticed that Emmanuel Macron has really wanted to be moving on things like Eurozone reform, that great snooze fest topic that no one really outside of this Brussels bubble particularly cares about. But it's something that he's wanted to move on. Angela Merkel hasn't been willing to explain it to the German public that some of that might be necessary for the EU to complete its union. And instead she went for this long-range vision that she's not really going to have to actually personally deliver on. So maybe some reaction on that, but then a couple of hypocrisies, I think, are built in there as well, where you've got Germany, a country that just will not meet its NATO targets, calling for a European army, and Donald Trump, who's saying the Europeans don't do enough on defense, and then basically getting all pissy when the Europeans say that they might have a plan for doing more on defense. What do you think about those competing
Hypocrisy
demands?
in politics, what a surprise. Look, there is no question that Germany has been slower than some of the other NATO allies in meeting and working toward the Wales Pledge, which is 2% of GDP each year. But again, there is a lot of history here, and there are quite a number of other European allies who look at Germany and say, you know what, we're willing to give you a discount, go slower. They are not so excited about the idea of a highly militarized Germany, given the history. Trump's comment is beyond ironic. Of course, he should have just declared victory. The minute Macron was talking about an EU army, Trump could have said, see, they're listening to me, they're doing exactly what I said, the US can't be paying for all this and taking care of them. And instead he just decided to say he's insulted, and it sounded quite ridiculous. But for Merkel and the question of the Eurozone, and we'll have a challenge if we come back and do this in a couple of weeks when the EU is talking about Eurozone reform. It's a little bit drier topic. Certainly it's something much easier for people to grab onto when she talks about an EU army. There's no question these things go hand in hand. Sometimes I remind people in Brussels when they're very impressed by US military capability that a synonym for US military might is unlimited deficit spending. You have to be able to spend if you want the drones, the tanks, the equipment, the soldiers that are needed to have a serious military operation. So these things go hand in hand. Macron maybe should be worried that by Merkel talking about an EU army, she doesn't want to talk about his Eurozone proposals. Maybe there's a harder road to travel there. But this is something coming up in December. The European Council has set a deadline for itself to take some action on that Eurozone front.
Yeah, and absolutely, we had a situation developing out of Brexit here, which is that, can you imagine that speech being given in a pre-Brexit era? I think that the answer to that is probably no. But on that note, I'm getting the wind up. We've got more exciting Politico action that's going to happen on stage down at the Residence Palace in a few minutes. So I'm going to do my own little Live Aid Concord mission down there and say goodbye to you. David, thank you so much for joining us on Coffee Break. See you next week.
Have a good weekend.